From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and joining me today is Dave Malinowski, who is a professor of linguistics and language development at San Jose State University. I've wanted to have Dave on the podcast for a long time because he's one of the leading voices in a field of study called linguistic landscape, which examines the relationship between language and public space. I asked Dave if he'd be willing to come on the podcast and give a basic introduction to this topic, and also if he could point to resources for any listeners who might be interested in going deeper into this field. I've included these resources in the show notes. Here's my conversation with Dave Malinowski. Dave Malinowski, thank you so much for being with me today. You're an assistant professor at San Jose State University in linguistics and language development. And today we're going to talk about a topic that you've done a lot of research on and a lot of scholarly work, that is linguistic landscapes. So to start off, could you just, in your own words, define this term linguistic landscapes? What are they? And, in a nutshell, what is a linguistic landscape?
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you for having me on this podcast. I'm a big fan. So linguistic landscape or linguistic landscapes, people use the singular and the plural. They mean maybe slightly different things, have to do with the symbolic construction of the public space. And that's a definition, actually, that's been around since probably 2005 or 2006 from Eli Ben-Rafael, Elana Shohamy, and others around Tel Aviv University who defined it that way. But symbolic construction of the public space is, I think, a really nice way of thinking about it. It's, in a simple way, a lot of people think about linguistic landscape as signs, as billboards and shop names and everything that's written down in public spaces that you might encounter when you're outside. And that's very true. But linguistic, as we know, isn't just limited to what's written. And so a lot of people are thinking about linguistic as spoken and as enacted, as gestured, and so on. And so this idea of symbolic construction in the public space, I think, is really more encompassing in that way. So language in the public space, visible and audible language in the public space, symbolic use in public spaces, all of those are pretty workable for linguistic landscape, I think.
So it seems like linguistic landscapes is really a kind of continuum of representations of language in public spaces. But can you give maybe one or two examples just so people have a concrete understanding of what an instantiation of a linguistic landscape might be?
Yeah, right. So I think a lot of folks may fixate on particular signs, right? And so we encounter a lot of things that we might talk about as signs in the very common, practical, everyday sense of street sign or billboard or shop sign or leaflet or some other kind of physical item that maybe has four sides on the outside, and that's one of the ways folks have defined it. But then you have the word landscape, which is an aggregate. It is a totality, and it gives us the sense that it is the language that's written generally or present in some way in the spaces in which we move through our everyday lives. And so in contradistinction to something like the language textbook, where the language we might focus on is all written down in a very defined and limited space, linguistic landscape tries to open our eyes to the languages and the voices that are present in our interactions with public spaces where other people move and live and shop and conduct their daily lives. And it also includes languages that we might encounter online. But it has to do with this sense of plurality of multiple languages, multiple voices, multiple colors, multiple fonts, different kinds of expression that are from the public, that are from governments, that are from businesses, that are from private individuals, all of them together creating this aggregate that we think about as the landscape.
So, I live in New York City, and
Yeah.
I live in northern Manhattan, and after this conversation, I'm going to take the subway back to my apartment, back to my home. And
Hmm.
I think I would imagine that the landscape that I'll encounter is a particularly rich one in terms
Yeah.
of the overlaying of different languages, languages
Yeah.
in different spaces. On the subway, for example, in New York City, there are many public service
Hmm.
announcement or ads,
Yeah.
printed ads talking about get your vaccine or, buy the new uh, Metro card that works better than the old one.
Yeah.
And so as I go home, I'm going to see the intersection of many different languages. And as I
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
home, I'm going to hear many, the subway is a very crowded place at rush hour, especially. So I will hear probably half
Hmm.
the people or more speaking Spanish and not English. So would
Yeah.
you say that all of these input, all of these, uh, I guess, emanations of language, is that what constitutes a linguistic landscape for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important that we bring in the idea of multiple languages and multiple voices, multiple dialects, multiplicities as a core idea of linguistic landscape. And people only started really being interested in linguistic landscape because we see these multiplicities, that different languages are present in place, in places that are familiar to us, and that they are present in very particular places, and they say very particular things. And all of the ways that those different languages are either present or absent, the way they say certain things or don't, the way that translations on signs sometimes are there in full and sometimes just in part and sometimes not at all, has everything to do with what linguistic landscape researchers are so interested in. Spanish is probably present in, it is the second most spoken and visibly present, I believe, language in New York City, although it depends incredibly not just on the borough as a whole, but on the neighborhood, on the street, on the business, on the particular space that you might be looking at. And so absolutely, that has to do with linguistic landscape and linguistic landscape. Folks who are interested in it, and those like me who started to become interested in linguistic landscape because we saw these meetings of different languages in public space, are always asking why is this language here, why is it saying this and not that, why when this language is spoken in public space is it visible or is it not visible. And one of the truisms I think of linguistic landscape is that in almost all circumstances there are many more languages that are audible in certain spaces than are visible, and the politics of literacy and representation absolutely play into that. So we want to know what the signs are saying, what languages they're in, and why it came to be that way.
So what are some of those whys? What are some of those reasons? What, causes a language to be heard but not written in some places? And is it just simply power? Is there another sort of determining factor that would cause a language to appear in one place and not in another? What are some of the what do you think about as a linguistic landscape researcher when you consider the presence or absence of languages in a landscape?
Yeah, this is such a great question, and there are people who have been thinking about this for a lot longer than the field or study area of linguistic landscape has been around. And the term as it is now used in a lot of sociolinguistics contexts, language policy research, social linguistics, and otherwise came around 1997 or so is when folks talk about the beginning of it. But of course, the field started much, much earlier than that too, with people interested in why certain languages are written and spoken in certain places. And there are lots of different explanations and reasons. One of the distinctions that people like to think about is the distinction between a top-down sign or top-down presence in the linguistic landscape, where, like you said just a few minutes ago, power is the overriding concern, and whether a language policy might be explicit, as in the naming practices in cities like Quebec, for instance, in Eastern Canada, or whether it is implicit, where in a lot of cities and in communities in the US, it's just assumed that English will be the predominant and preeminent mode of communication. There is a sense in which governments, with their resources and the certain sort of alchemy of power that they represent, express themselves in one or a very few number of languages. And so top-down creators, governments who are naming streets and public transit and that kind of a thing will choose one or a very small number of languages to use, and generally in a more uniform way. Whereas we talk about bottom-up signing practices, also the individuals who might be multilingual, who might come from varying language backgrounds and identities, might use their own heritage language or a language that they hope to represent, and the language perhaps that they speak with their community of speakers in a way that might be quite different from what the government or another sort of large organization or institution would use. And so that tension between top down and bottom up is one way I think that we can think about why certain languages appear in certain places. But it's a huge area of research that a lot of folks are looking at, and there's not just one simple answer.
I can imagine that a top-down use of language in a public space provokes a kind of bottom-up reaction in some circumstances, perhaps in an area where language is contested, or maybe where you have a government sort of imposing a language and the people living in that area don't want to go along with that, because language is power in a way. The fact of language is related to power existing in a certain place, especially when the language is sort of imposed and not autochthonous, just what people are speaking where in a specific space. So does that happen a lot? Do you, when you look at examples drawn from linguistic landscapes, do you see this kind of rebellion or linguistic rebellion or talking back to the top-down language choices?
Yes, you absolutely do. I think there's a little caveat that I probably should put out first, which is that folks who are interested in linguistic landscape, who pay very close attention to the subtle differences in written expression that are used by these various actors in public space, isn't everybody, and we're not often, always conscious of that. Also, if a community is primarily Mandarin speaking, for instance, and there are signs that appear only in English and that, or by a government entity that is attempting to control or sway a readership in a certain way with language used, with English use, you might find people who resist it subtly and in ways that are hard to pick up. It's not always that you'll find people who put stickers over the English and say, no, this should be in Chinese, right? Although that happens, areas where there are long-standing and very large-scale, differences in history where two different communities or multiple communities of people come together in the same geographic space. Ireland is one place where the Irish language and English language have been in tension for a long time. And you do find some of that playing out on street signs. Quebec and Canada with French and English is one other place where you see that. And you see it in many, many communities in and out through the U.S. There's been legislation passed in certain neighborhoods in New York City as well, where there's been legislation against the posting of signboards monolingually in non-English languages, specifically targeting sometimes visually different scripted languages sometimes. So occasionally these kinds of conflicts and tensions might play out in policy or other official spaces. Sometimes they'll be contested by people who spray paint or put stickers or do other things. But very often that kind of resistance happens, but it happens verbally or even in terms of your own emotional or affective response to feeling out of place, for instance, when you see a different language somewhere that you might expect a different one.
I've certainly experienced that myself. Every time I drive past Donald J. Trump State Park, I have a verbal reaction to that sign. But
you have a reaction, right?
Yeah, but I don't inscribe it, in writing.
We could explore that.
Let's not explore that. No, no. But so, but I was kind of curious about a different example of a top-down
Hmm.
usage of language in a public space that I'm not sure if you, to what extent people contemplate this, where it's a top-down, decision to include a language for either convenience sake or, to be nice or to kind of say, oh, we're inclusive. For example, on the New York City subway, there's often a sign
Hmm.
in not English or Spanish, but maybe Vietnamese or Polish or some other,
Right.
and it's just kind of saying, look how great New York is. You know, it's a crucible of all these different languages. That's sort of one example, and another could be, say I was
Hmm.
in Thailand for a conference a couple of months ago, and there was a lot
Yeah.
of English, and
Hmm.
on public sign. It didn't seem to me like it was an attempt to really impose that language, just make it easier for people who don't
Right.
read the Thai script or no Thai
Yeah.
to be able to navigate that space. So how would you consider that usage, that top down usage of written language?
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting because there's a huge variety of uses, purposes, and judgments we might make as readers of a particular use of language in a particular situation that we might feel is authentic or effective for a certain purpose or another. And certainly languages like English, Chinese, Spanish, Arabic, and others that have a very large sphere of influence that are considered to be lingua francas will be used by top-down agencies and bottom-up actors also in an effort to have a wider audience, to appeal to a more general sort of readership, to appeal maybe to certain values, whether they be cosmopolitan or economic or others that might be associated with those signs. And so you do find that efforts to translate signs or post signs in different languages are appealing to those kind of maybe economic or other interests. There's an interesting distinction that's made in a wonderful book from 2003 by Ron Scollin and Susie Wong Scollin called Discourses in Place, and I recommend that to everyone who's interested in linguistic landscape. Although it doesn't call itself linguistic landscape, it is very cited and used in the literature on linguistic landscape. And one of the things that they point out there is talking about this distinction between, they say, indexicality and symbolic or symbolicity. I don't think they use that word, but essentially they ask the question and how is the use of any particular language or any particular script or any other kind of symbolic element in an expression, how is that indexical of certain identities and certain relationships and certain properties, and how is it symbolic? And the meaning that they ascribe to both of those terms is that, we might intend to create a certain perception with regard to our use of this versus that language on a sign, and that might be symbolic. So if English in certain context is considered to be a more cosmopolitan language, then using English, even in a non-speaking, generally English area, might be interpreted as a symbolic use, that it is lending a certain air or a certain value to a sign that might be written more pragmatically in a non-English language, in a different language. That would be something they might consider to be a symbolic use of a language, whereas the meaning that Scollin and Scollin give to this idea of indexicality, which is obviously a huge notion and researched in social linguistics and anthropology and so on, is that the use of this or that particular language indexes or points to a social or political or geographic reality that exists that would lead someone to use that language without necessarily trying to create some kind of impression or to sway or this or that way a particular audience. So my use of English in this podcast with you right now is sort of indexical of the fact that, English is a lingua franca. We're in the United States. We're addressing a podcast audience, I think, that is used to and is expecting to receive this information that we're conveying in English. And I'm not particularly trying to, although I would be really struggling to say all these things in other languages, but it's sort of indexical of our relationship, of the nature of the podcast, perhaps, and the larger institutional context in which it relies. So that's a really long-winded way of kind of saying that there are indexical layers and symbolic layers to every expression, and to varying degrees. In some cases, there might not be a symbolic reading so much of a sign, and there might be, certain kinds of indexical meanings that are given to it. But those are some of the things we might think about in trying to peel off the layers or pull apart sort of where is this coming from? How come this sign right here and right now in this condition, in this color, in this expression, in this style is written in English, or is written in a mixture of languages, or is written in Hindi, or is something else. Yeah.
And, I think it's probably true that me saying, well, it's, in Thailand, having English on some signs is very great. It's useful because, if I hadn't had that, I would not have been able to find my way around. But, it's really a question of perspective. A person who lives in Thailand might be unhappy that, we have these signs in English that kind of represent the influx of Westerners and sort of, creating a certain kind of economic condition that maybe is not favorable to them from their perspective.
Absolutely. You could easily imagine someone looking at these sort of attempts by a government agency to internationalize, and I'm not sure about the specific policies that exist in different Thai government agencies, but I've lived and worked in Japan for a little while too, and I do know folks who are interested might want to check out a book by Peter Backhaus, Linguistic Landscapes, from 2007, which is one of the foundational studies in linguistic landscape. And he was very well versed in Japanese government language policy and also bottom-up use there too, and really showed in some detail how English is used, how it's positioned with respect to Japanese in public signs that government agencies put out, how Korean and Chinese are also used, the order that those four languages must appear in, script sizes, so that you might expect to see certain languages in that hierarchy, and it is a hierarchy, appear in different sizes, for instance, different font sizes. And then, of course, translation and the degree to which content is present or not in one or all of those languages is another question, too.
So, that's one of the amazing things about this field is, in my opinion, and you can tell me if you agree, is you can really go pretty deep into peeling back layer after layer, but at the same time, if you're maybe a language student, or if you're somebody who's just starting to ask questions about the relation of languages to one another in a specific space, it's really a kind of lens that you can put on and view things through this lens. You don't necessarily, you can immediately start to ask very poignant questions about what's going on, how languages relate to each other. And so I was wondering, when you think about language learning, language teaching and language learning, language pedagogy, what role, in your opinion, does the linguistic landscape lens give to people who are engaged in language study?
Yeah, that's wonderful. I do work with a lot of language teachers and students who are fascinated by and who are interested in this area of study, and the idea that you can, first of all, go outside the classroom, and hopefully, if you're in a place where you might hope to see or hear some of the language that you're studying, then observe and take pictures of language in use in some of the more mundane and everyday areas, then it's a huge benefit. Linguistic landscape, I think for me, one of the great things about it, as far as, and I have a cat who's jumping up, and so at this point I'm just going to have to have her say hello, and I think the viewership and readership will probably spike right about now.
The internet loves cats.
The internet does love cats, and this is Dorothy, and she feels very jealous when we're doing things that don't have to do with her, so I apologize for that. She has to have that attention. But so absolutely. the exciting thing for me is that you can learn outside, and that you can learn from all the myriad examples that you see outside. And it challenges, linguistic landscape does, the language of the textbook, the idea of a standard language, the idea that there is one way to say or write something, the idea of correctness and incorrectness. And so for me, it does lend itself to a particular approach or thinking about language teaching and learning, which is based in the descriptive reality, right, of how people actually speak. And we know that everyone speaks differently. Everyone writes a little differently. And the struggle to learn a standard language is just that. It's how to conform with, and when to conform and when not to conform to. The fact that languages in almost all classrooms that teach language are taught to the isolation of other languages generally. Languages typically have one, there's usually one language. You don't usually go into a language class that teaches you German and Turkish, for instance. But why not? Because these languages in the lives of so many people are in constant interaction and negotiation between the two. And so the fact that linguistic landscape is so multi, that you see so many different voices and languages coming together, is an opportunity for some, even though it may feel slightly scary maybe and a little messy for some teachers who maybe need to or want to teach to a standard curriculum. But that messiness of the real world, the authenticity of discourse in place, real places, as mixed and hybrid as it is, I think is a real opportunity for students to hear and encounter and see other people's voices and authentic, genuine expression, and for teachers to think about ways they can use that to really boost their students' not just linguistic knowledge, but language awareness, their sociocultural knowledge, and lots of other areas.
So if you were helping a teacher starting to think about how to incorporate linguistic landscape into their classroom, or maybe a student who independently is interested in this topic, what are some things that you might say to them to kind of orient them to this? How would you have them begin to organize their thinking about this, just in a very basic sense?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a great question, and I know so many of us in research and teaching both, and I think each of those parts of the equation is equally important. And you don't have to necessarily deal with the research if you're super interested in if you're a teacher who is primarily interested in just thinking about this for teaching. It's very easy to get super excited about it by going out and taking pictures of everything and becoming kind of like a bug collector and going out and collecting hundreds and hundreds of signs, and then sometimes encountering a class full of students who think, so that's maybe not so interesting, right? It's not the thing that I'm interested in with regard to learning language. And so part of it is understanding, what you're teaching and what you're learning, if you're a student, what your learning goals might be, and how those goals may or may not be intersecting with any language that's available to you. If you're teaching a language other than English in the United States, the chances are good that the language that you're studying is not visible anywhere close to where you maybe live or where you study. And if it is, great. If it's not, though, then this poses some additional challenges. So I just wanted to put that kind of caveat out there too, because I think it is really important to think this is not a be all and end all for language learning and teaching. But I do think that even if you are a student in a Spanish language class who is studying Spanish, that paying attention to, let's say you have a mostly English linguistic environment in your school and home area, paying attention to using linguistic landscape to really pay attention to how language is used to label and interact with and discuss items and actions of your everyday life is really, really important. And it's very insightful, and it builds up your awareness of how language intersects with life, with action, with thought, with ideology, and seeing specifically how different spaces are labeled, how people are referred to and labeled in different contexts is especially fruitful, I think. So what different labels do you find for people different identities do you find? How, for instance, this is an activity I like to do with some of my students who maybe not even language classes, but who haven't thought about how language is so intimately tied up with how we exist in our bodies in places. For instance, is our landscape gendered, right?
Mm.
How the relabeling and renaming and sort of reconstruction in some cases of bathrooms on university campuses is just one small example of how gender and space and our own embodied experience intersect, and paying attention to how a university environment may be gendered space, how it labels itself explicitly, and assumptions that you might feel as a student moving throughout these different spaces on campus, I think is a real opportunity. So again, long answer boiled down to a short one is start paying attention. And as a teacher, maybe the teacher can help the students to pay attention to very specific areas of interest that the students might have. But writing journals, making audio recordings, taking pictures, bringing them back into the classroom to discuss how their experiences in their everyday lives are languaged, and what kind of questions those raise, how different students' experiences are similar to or different from each other, says a whole lot, I think, and is a really nice starting point, even if in a like L2 classroom, you're not actually even working with the L2, I think can be really, really valuable for students.
So I can imagine, this is, as we've discussed, there's so many layers to this. For somebody who might be interested in learning more about linguistic landscapes, either as a, for use in a classroom, or just sort of thinking through maybe the pedagogical side of it. I know that you were part of a group of people who created a book about this. And can you talk a little bit about that? That book, which I think is possible to download.
Yes, yeah, thank you for the plug. So yeah, absolutely. There are a few books I am happy to offer, and mine, the ones that I've been working on, are not the only ones that are out there as well. I would say that there are a lot of books out there right now that are of quite potentially really, really high interest to people who are interested in language learning and teaching. And I would say there's one actually I'd mentioned even before mine by someone named Osman Solmaz and Steve Prismus, which is LL and ELT, Linguistic Landscape and English Language Teaching, which is very practically minded, and it's a downloadable, freely downloadable. You can search for it and download it. Book of short chapters that are applications, mostly from the K through 12 age group and setting across mostly in Turkey, but also in the US, of teachers who have experimented and tried using linguistic landscape for various teaching and learning purposes. And so I think that is a really nice, accessible space to come in. I've worked on a couple of books with a couple of colleagues. So Hiram Maxim, who is over at Emory University, and Sebastien Dubré, who is at Carnegie Mellon, have teamed up and worked together since 2016, when we had a special interest group get together in at the AAAL, the American Association of Applied Linguistics conference, and had many participants come together and say we want to research and also think about pedagogical applications for teaching. So we've got a couple of books out. Language Teaching in the Linguistic Landscape is one, came out with Springer in 2020, and then Open Access book, a second companion to that book, has just come out from Springer as well, called Spatializing Language Studies. And that one is, as you said, freely downloadable. Together, those two books have probably in the neighborhood of 24, 25 chapters of unique sort of empirical research done by teachers who are also researchers. And I think some of the most interesting work in linguistic landscape for educational purposes is by authors who are wearing both of those hats, who are in the classroom, who are observing others' classrooms, and who are really interested in the various ways LL is used.
Before we started recording, we were speaking, and you mentioned that you have a handout that you've given to instructors as they're starting to think about linguistic landscapes in their classes. And I
Yeah.
was wondering, would you mind sharing that with our audience on the podcast?
Oh, absolutely. It's a distillation of the first chapter, some of the principles from the Spatializing Language Studies book, and I'll be happy to send it to you, sure.
Okay, and I will include that in the show notes below the episode here. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for this conversation, Dave. It's been a pleasure, and I encourage anybody who's listening, whether you're a language teacher or a language learner or just interested in this topic, to check out the books that you've mentioned. And I can only thank you again for this rich conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me.